had always loved hiking. There was something about the woods that felt like home to me, as if every tree, every rustling leaf, whispered secrets I was meant to understand. It was an escape from the noise of the world, a place where I could lose myself and be alone with my thoughts. That's why I decided to take the trip, to go for that hike through the rough, barely marked trail deep in the forest. I'd read about it online, a hidden path that led to an incredible lookout point with a breathtaking view. The kind of view that would make all the miles of trudging through mud and sweat worth it. I packed a bag the night before, double-checking my water, snacks, first aid kit, and a flashlight. I wasn't planning to be out there long, just a day hike. But something felt different about this one. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my gut told me that I should be cautious. Still, I didn't let that stop me. The morning was chilly, the kind of crisp air that felt sharp against my skin as soon as I stepped outside. I felt the burn in my lungs as I inhaled deeply. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I adjusted my pack, tightened my boots, and set off toward the trailhead. Started off easy enough. The path was well worn at first, just the typical dirt trail with the occasional rock or root to step over. Birds chirped above me, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was peaceful, even a little beautiful, as I made my way further from civilization. I passed a few hikers here and there, but the trail wasn't crowded, and that suited me perfectly. The further I went, the less the trail looked like something people used often. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't maintained either. There were signs of old, faded markers on the trees, but they were hard to make out. The path narrowed, the vegetation thickening around me. I had to push through tall grasses and low-hanging branches. The world seemed quieter here, as if the trees themselves were trying to muffle the noise. I didn't mind though. Felt more like an adventure now. The air grew denser, the sunlight softer as the canopy thickened. I moved forward, determined to reach that lookout, the promise of an incredible view keeping me going. But after a while, the path seemed to start fading away. The familiar trail markers disappeared, leaving nothing but trees, rocks, and underbrush. I looked around, confused. I checked my map, something I rarely had to do, but I didn't recognize the landmarks. The trail had veered off from the one I had read about, and I couldn't tell if I was still on the right path. A sense of unease settled over me. I could turn back, I thought. It would be easier that way. But then, just ahead of me, I saw a faint trail cutting through the trees. It was barely visible, but it seemed to lead in the right direction. I hesitated for a moment, staring at it, then made my decision. I took a deep breath and pressed forward. Felt like a mistake from the beginning, but I pushed that thought aside. Maybe I was just overthinking it. The air grew thicker, cooler. The trees were dense now, twisting and gnarled, blocking out more and more sunlight. A heavy fog began to settle in, drifting through the woods like it was alive. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. The trail was becoming harder to follow, and I felt a growing sense of isolation. After what felt like hours of pushing through thick underbrush, I began to notice something strange. The forest had an eerie quiet about it. I hadn't heard a bird or any animal sounds for a while now. The silence was unsettling. Even the breeze had stopped, leaving the leaves motionless in the air. It felt as if nature itself had held its breath. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. I checked my map again. I should have been nearing the lookout by now, but there was no sign of it. Only more trees, more fog, and more silence. I took a swig of water and looked around, trying to gather myself. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity when I saw something, a shape off in the distance. My heart raced and I tried to make it out through the fog. It was a figure standing still, almost motionless. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, and I could barely make out any features. just a silhouette against the mist. I thought it was another hiker at first, maybe someone else who had gotten lost. But as I stared at it, something felt wrong. The figure didn't seem natural. It didn't sway in the wind, didn't seem affected by the chill. It just stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I blinked again, the figure was gone. There was nothing but fog and trees. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I'd just seen. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and go back, but I didn't. I kept walking. The fog grew thicker, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I stumbled over rocks and roots, my mind buzzing with unease. Where was the trail? Where was the lookout? The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees so dense I felt like they were watching me. The feeling of being surrounded, trapped, was overwhelming. Then I saw it, clearing. It was small, but it was open. No trees, no brush. I stepped into it, gasping for breath as I looked around. There was something strange about this place. The air felt heavier here, like the world was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing, there was a stone, a large, flat rock, partially covered in moss. The fog swirled around it, and for some reason, I couldn't take my eyes off it. I approached the stone cautiously, my feet moving without thinking. The closer I got, the more unsettled I became. The air felt charged, as if the place was alive with something I couldn't understand. And then I saw it, a mark carved into the stone. At first, I thought it was just weathering, but as I leaned closer, I realized it was deliberate. A symbol, an intricate design that looked almost like an old tribal marking. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't belong here, not in this part of the forest. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Why would there be a symbol like that carved into the stone? Who would do something like that? I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The quiet felt suffocating now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I turned, ready to leave the clearing, when I heard something, a rustling noise from behind me, just beyond the fog. My body froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see an animal, a deer maybe, but there was nothing, just the same dense mist and trees. I took another step, but the rustling came again, closer this time. I looked frantically around, trying to see what was making the noise, but the fog was too thick. My breathing quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, followed by more rustling. I spun around, my pulse racing, but still, I couldn't see anything. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and sprinted out of the clearing, my feet slipping on the wet ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the lookout point. I just wanted to get out of there. The fog seemed to close in around me, the trees crowding in like they were trying to block my way. I stumbled, fell, and got back up, my body aching from the effort. But I didn't stop. I ran and ran until the fog began to lift and the trees started to thin. The trail appeared in front of me again, clearer now, and I didn't hesitate. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my legs trembling. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the doors locked, and the engine running. Looking back, I don't know what I saw that day or what happened in those woods. But I do know one thing, I'll never hike that trail again. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain, and I don't ever want to find out what it was. The early morning light broke over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees as I laced up my boots and stood up, feeling the tightness in my muscles from yesterday's hike. I was no stranger to the wilderness, But there was something different about this trip. I'd chosen a trail that was a little off the beaten path, far from the crowded, well-traveled routes that most tourists favored. I didn't expect to meet anyone, and that's exactly what I wanted. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the faint hum of distant birds was the only sound as I took my first step onto the trail. It wasn't a long trail, but it was known for being secluded, winding through dense forest and ending at a viewpoint that offered sweeping views of the valley below. I'd heard mixed things about it. Some said it was peaceful, others claimed it was unsettling, but all agreed it was far from popular. The first few miles were simple. The trail was narrow but well-marked, the kind that doesn't require too much focus to stay on track. The trees overhead formed a dense canopy, casting the path in a calming, dappled light. I kept my pace steady, moving at a comfortable speed, with only the sound of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves beneath my boots breaking the quiet. The occasional bird call echoed through the forest, but nothing out of the ordinary caught my attention. As the trail continued, the forest grew thicker, and the ground beneath my feet became uneven, with jagged rocks and roots that reached up like fingers. The air, once fresh, began to feel heavier, thicker. My breathing became more labored as I navigated the increasingly rough terrain. I wasn't worried, though. It was just a normal part of hiking, right? A few more hours passed, and I was far into the woods. I had reached the area where the trail narrowed and became less obvious. I noticed that the trees were taller here, their trunks wider and knotted with age. The air smelled different, like damp moss and wet earth. Something about it felt a little off, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. I was getting closer to the viewpoint, I told myself. I had to keep going. Then I saw it. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shadow, a dark patch between two trees. But as I moved closer, I realized it was a small, dilapidated cabin. I wasn't expecting to see anything like it, especially out here, so deep in the woods. It didn't look like anyone had been around for years. The roof sagged in the middle, the walls were weathered, and there were vines creeping up the side, almost as though the cabin was trying to blend back into the forest. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There was no mention of a cabin on the trail's map or in the guidebook. Was I lost? No, I had been following the trail markers, and this cabin wasn't on any of the paths I had researched. It was far off the main route, hidden from sight. I stood there for a few moments, contemplating. I had two choices: turn back and retrace my steps, or continue on the trail, ignoring the cabin entirely. My gut instinct told me to turn around, but there was something compelling about it. Something curious. Maybe it was the sense of isolation that drew me in, the idea of seeing something no one else had noticed. I cautiously stepped toward the cabin, the wooden floor creaking beneath my boots as I approached. I didn't touch the door. It hung slightly ajar, swaying ever so slightly in the wind. The silence in the area seemed unnatural. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had fallen still, holding its breath. I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The interior was dim, the light filtering through the cracked windows. Old furniture sat inside. Nothing remarkable, just a few broken chairs and a dusty table. But what caught my eye were the walls. There were markings scratched into the wood, old and faded. At first, I couldn't make sense of them, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. The marks formed strange symbols, patterns that didn't seem to belong to any language I recognized. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly felt like I had made a mistake by coming here. The air felt heavier, as if something was watching me. I quickly backed away from the cabin, deciding that it was best to move on. But just as I turned to leave, I heard something. A faint sound in the distance, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I froze. My heart raced in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound wasn't quite right. It was too deliberate, too human. I stood there, waiting, listening. The noise stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and my instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and I wasn't sure whether to keep moving or to hide. I chose to keep moving. I pushed myself forward, my legs feeling heavy and uncooperative. The forest seemed darker now, the trees looming taller and closer together. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. I had to keep going, I told myself, just a little further to the viewpoint. The thought of seeing the view, of being out of this unsettling forest, pushed me onward. But as I walked, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I heard the crunch of twigs again, and this time it was unmistakable. Someone was behind me, just out of sight. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I run? Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to that terrifying realization. I wasn't alone out here. I broke into a jog, not looking back, only focusing on the trail ahead. The air felt suffocating, thick with tension. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a nearby tree. I had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, the trees finally began to thin out, and I saw a break in the canopy ahead. The viewpoint was close. I could almost taste the fresh air, the freedom of being out in the open. But as I reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing at the edge of the cliff, was a man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, his back turned toward me. His posture was rigid, and he stood completely still, as though waiting for something. My stomach twisted with unease. He didn't seem to notice me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been waiting for me. I stood there, paralyzed, watching him for a long time. My breath was shallow, my body tense. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. After what felt like an eternity, the man slowly turned toward me. His face was gaunt, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. There was something in his gaze, something wild, something desperate. He didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to plead with me, as though warning me to leave. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. He looked like someone who had been out here for far too long, someone who had lost touch with reality. I couldn't bring myself to speak either, so I took a step back, then another. Slowly, I turned and began to walk away, my feet heavy with dread. I didn't dare look back. As I retraced my steps, I realized something. The forest had returned to its natural state. The oppressive silence was gone. The birds were chirping again, the wind rustling through the trees. I was still shaken, but I wasn't being followed anymore. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted. I hadn't run into anyone else, and there was no sign of the man. The sun was beginning to set as I reached the parking lot, the orange glow of the evening sky filling the horizon. The quiet of the forest was behind me, but the strange encounter lingered in my mind. I don't know what happened back there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me, but I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes. I don't know if he was lost or if he had a reason for being out there, but I know one thing for sure: I won't be returning to that trail. Sometimes the wilderness isn't as peaceful as it seems. Sometimes it holds things we're better off not knowing. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a quick getaway from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head and enjoy the outdoors. I had been working too hard lately. Long hours, tight deadlines, the kind of life that makes you forget what fresh air smells like. So, when I saw the trail map in the small, local outdoor store, I decided to take a day off and escape into nature for a while. The trail was called Bear Creek Trail, named after a creek that snaked through the valley. It wasn't a long hike, just about 6 miles round trip, with some elevation gain but not enough to make it too strenuous. The map said it was moderately trafficked, which I liked, busy enough to feel safe but not so crowded that it would be annoying. I grabbed a bottle of water, a couple of snacks, and headed out to the trailhead. The drive there was peaceful, and the morning air was crisp. There weren't too many cars in the parking lot when I arrived, just a couple of old trucks with bikes strapped to their roofs. The trailhead sign looked weathered but still sturdy, its black letters outlining the path ahead. As I adjusted the straps on my backpack, I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. There was something calming about being in the wilderness, something that made all the stress and anxiety I had been carrying feel lighter. I started down the path, the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel beneath me the only noise in the air. The trees loomed tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was peaceful at first, just the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional bird call overhead. The trail wound through dense forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in broken beams. The smell of pine filled my nostrils, a fresh, earthy scent that felt like the smell of freedom itself. About half an hour into the hike, I passed a small creek that trickled along the side of the trail. The water was clear, moving swiftly over smooth rocks. I paused for a moment, squatting down to take a drink from the stream. The cold water was refreshing, the perfect way to break up the monotony of the hike. It was then that I noticed something odd. A small, crumpled piece of paper lodged between two rocks near the edge of the creek. It looked out of place, the kind of thing you wouldn't expect to find in a natural setting like this. Curiosity got the better of me, so I reached down and pulled it free. It was a weathered map, hand-drawn and faded in some parts, but still legible. There were strange markings on it, circles and lines that didn't make much sense at first. At the top, it read Bear Creek Trail, look to the falls. The ink looked old, but the writing was recent. Something about it made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't quite explain why. I folded the map back up and slipped it into my pocket, deciding it wasn't worth dwelling on. Maybe someone had just gotten lost or left it behind. It wasn't unusual for hikers to misplace things, especially on a trail as remote as this one. I continued on, the path becoming steeper as I made my way higher into the mountains. The sun was creeping higher in the sky now, and I could feel the warmth on my face. The air was thin up here, and each step felt like it required more effort. The forest around me had started to thin, the trees becoming shorter and more sparse as the trail neared the rocky outcroppings that marked the higher elevations. As I hiked, the silence deepened. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, more like a kind of heavy stillness that settled over the land. There were no birds, no animal calls, just the soft wind and the rhythmic sound of my breathing. I had expected to see a few other hikers by now, but the trail was eerily empty. The few cars in the parking lot hadn't left much of a crowd behind. The first sign that something was off came when I reached a fork in the trail. The map had shown only one main route, but now there were two options. One path seemed to continue up the mountain, winding toward the ridge where the falls were marked on the map. The other path veered off to the left, disappearing into the thick brush and trees. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had missed something on the map. There had been no mention of another route. I stood there for a while, just staring at the split in the path. The air felt thicker here, somehow charged, as if I was standing at a crossroads that went beyond the physical. It was as though the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my choice. I thought about the map I had found earlier, the one with the strange markings. Look to the falls, it had said. Maybe this was the path the map was referring to. The left trail seemed less traveled, more rugged, while the right one seemed to continue on as the main route. But there was something compelling about the left path, something that made me feel like I needed to go that way. I don't know what it was, but it felt important. I decided to take the left trail. It was narrow and overgrown, the brush brushing against my legs as I pushed my way through. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as though they had been standing watch over this land for centuries. The trail became harder to follow, disappearing at times beneath thick layers of fallen leaves and branches. But something about it kept drawing me forward. As I climbed higher, the temperature began to drop. The wind had picked up, cutting through the trees with a sharpness that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The sound of the creek from earlier had faded away, replaced now by a kind of haunting silence. It was almost as if the world around me had gone completely still. I noticed something strange then, a set of footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they might be from a deer or some other animal, but they were too large, too deep. They were human and they looked fresh. I froze. My heart started to race. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail up until this point, and the thought that someone else had passed through here so recently sent a chill down my spine. The footprints led up the trail, away from the main path, and I found myself following them without even realizing it. The further I went, the more unnerving it became. The trees closed in on me, their shadows darkening the path until it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The silence was overwhelming, and every now and then I would hear something snap in the underbrush, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. Then I saw it. It was the waterfall. I had made it to the falls, though it wasn't anything like I had imagined. The water was dark, swirling in a deep pool before cascading over the edge into the rocky ravine below. The noise was deafening now, the sound of the water crashing against the rocks vibrating in my chest. But it wasn't the waterfall itself that caught my attention. It was the man standing there. He was standing near the edge of the falls, staring out over the water. He didn't seem to notice me at first, and I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The man was tall, dressed in weathered hiking gear, and his back was turned toward me. I couldn't see his face, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood, motionless, like a statue. I took a step forward, unsure if I should approach him. But before I could move any closer, he turned sharply, his eyes locking onto mine. His expression was unreadable, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. I was caught off guard, the sudden shift in his posture making my heart skip a beat. "Are you okay?" I asked, the question escaping my lips before I could stop it. He didn't answer. Instead, he just nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging my presence. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Something didn't feel right. The encounter, brief as it was, had left me feeling unsettled, like I had just crossed some invisible line into a place I wasn't supposed to be. But there was no sign of him now, just the waterfall, the rushing water, and the thickening silence. I didn't want to linger, felt wrong, dangerous even, but I forced myself to stay calm. I turned around and started retracing my steps. The hike back was long, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man reappear, but he didn't. The forest seemed quieter now, the air heavier. As I neared the trailhead, I saw no sign of the truck that had been parked near my car when I arrived. There was no one else around. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The day had passed quicker than I had realized, and the whole experience felt like a blur. I loaded my things back into the car, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was that man? Why did he seem so strange? As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, following me the entire time. Something that wasn't quite human. It was supposed to be just a short hike, a simple way to escape the city for a while and clear my head. But that day, everything seemed a little off. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just my mood. I'd been stressed out lately, work piling up, an argument with a friend, the usual mess life throws at you when you least expect it. I needed to disconnect from all that. Nature was my escape. I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, the sky still gray and overcast. No one else was around. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots as I stretched and prepared my gear. I'd done this hike a few times before. It wasn't particularly difficult, just a steady incline through thick trees that eventually opened up to a breathtaking view of the valley below. I liked that it wasn't crowded, especially on a weekday morning. The air had a crispness to it, a freshness that comes with early spring. The smell of pine trees and damp earth filled my nose as I set off down the trail. The dirt path was well worn, and at first, everything felt normal. I wasn't rushing, I just walked. My steps matched the rhythm of my thoughts, one foot in front of the other, trying to push away the noise in my head. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sound of the highway behind me faded, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. Birds chirped, the occasional rustle of small creatures darting through the underbrush. It felt peaceful, like all the weight I had been carrying was lifting off my shoulders. For a moment, I forgot about everything else. But then, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything specific, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A heaviness in the air, almost as if the trees themselves were watching me. I tried to shake it off. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me, tired from the stress. I kept walking, focusing on the path ahead. The trail twisted through the woods, curving and climbing. The canopy above thickened, letting in less light. I was used to the occasional feeling of isolation in the forest, but today it felt more pronounced. The deeper I went, the less I heard. The birds had stopped singing. The air was too still. It didn't sit right with me, but I didn't turn back. I was already a good distance in, and I knew the views at the top would be worth it. I kept going, but the quiet seemed to stretch longer and longer. The trail narrowed as I climbed, the trees crowding closer together. I stopped once to adjust my pack, the silence around me now starting to feel almost unnatural. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard any kind of noise besides my own footsteps. The trail took a sharp turn around a cluster of boulders, and that's when I saw it. A faint mark, barely noticeable, etched into the bark of a tree. It was hard to describe. It wasn't a carving or a scratch, more like a smudge of dark, irregular streaks. The tree was an old one, thick and tall, the kind you'd expect to find in a place untouched by time. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Something about the mark sent a chill through me. I had no reason to think it was anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was. I glanced around, but the woods were quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a random mark from a storm or perhaps an animal. I moved on, trying to keep my mind focused on the path ahead, but the unease lingered. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like this on a hike, but today it seemed more intense. The path eventually opened up, revealing a small clearing. I took a deep breath, relieved to feel the open space. But even here, the air felt different. The sky was darker now, clouds rolling in thicker, and there was no longer any wind. The trees felt like they were closing in on me. At the far edge of the clearing, there was a small creek. I knelt down to take a drink, cupping my hands in the cool water. The moment my lips touched the surface, I heard something. A sound, faint but unmistakable, something snapping underfoot. It was too far away to be a person, but close enough that it made my heart race. I stood up, looking around. There was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something inside me felt unsettled. The noise had come from the trees behind me, further into the woods. I debated turning back, but couldn't bring myself to do it. I was so close to the summit, so close to the view that had been calling me. It was only another half-mile or so. I pressed on, walking faster now, trying to put the strange feeling behind me. The woods were getting denser, the trees closer together, their twisted branches blocking out more of the sky. The trail grew steeper, winding through thick undergrowth. My breathing quickened as I pushed myself up, my legs aching. It was then that I heard it again, the snap of a branch. This time it was closer, just behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. The trail was empty. The sound of the forest was swallowed up by the overwhelming silence. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. It was probably just an animal, but this didn't feel like any hike I'd been on before. The air was thick, the woods strangely quiet. Even the trees seemed to be closing in. I forced myself to keep moving, hoping the summit would be around the next corner. But the trail seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, and that unsettling feeling in my chest grew with every footstep. Something wasn't right. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the path. It was a person, just standing there, watching me. At first, I thought it was someone else hiking, maybe someone who had gotten off the trail. But the way they stood, perfectly still, didn't seem natural. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, and their face was turned slightly away from me. The longer I looked, the more the figure seemed to blur, almost like they weren't quite there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clammy. I tried to call out, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked into the woods without a sound, disappearing behind the trees. I didn't wait to process what had just happened. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the path with a sense of urgency that I couldn't control. I wanted to get out of there. I needed to get out. The rest of the hike was a blur. I moved quickly, dodging over roots and rocks, the path seeming to stretch on endlessly. The air felt heavier with each step, and I could still feel the presence of the figure, like they were watching me, following me. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I forced myself to keep moving. Eventually, I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, a quiet, ordinary presence in the sea of trees. I didn't even bother to take a second to relax. I threw open the door, got in, and drove off without a second thought. As I left the trail behind me, I could finally feel the tension begin to leave my body, though the unease still lingered. What had I just seen? Who had that been? There was no explanation for it, no reason that made any sense. But one thing was clear. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong in the woods. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. All I wanted was to put that forest behind me and move on. It wasn't until much later that I realized I'd forgotten to check my watch. When I finally glanced at it, I saw the time. The entire hike, from start to finish, had taken much longer than I'd thought. Almost as if the trail had been playing tricks on me, stretching time itself. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my mind playing games. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Even now, thinking about it, I still wonder if something truly was following me that day, or if I just let my fears get the better of me. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back to that trail again. I never considered myself a reckless person, but sometimes it only takes one wrong turn for everything to go sideways. It started as a typical Saturday morning. I'd been planning to hike for weeks, just a simple solo trip through the Oak Ridge Trail. Nothing too crazy. I had my backpack, water, snacks, and a map of the trail which was clearly marked. It was supposed to be a peaceful, quiet day, away from the noise of the world. I'd done this sort of thing before, nothing out of the ordinary. When I reached the trailhead, the sun was already up, and the air had that crisp bite to it, like the kind that makes you feel awake without being too cold. The trail looked pretty well trodden, the dirt packed down, and the trees formed a canopy above that shaded most of the path. It was just me, the forest, and the steady rhythm of my boots crunching over the ground. It was supposed to be a simple hike, that's all. But by the time I'd walked a few miles in, something started to feel off. The forest around me, once welcoming and vibrant, now felt still, too still. There was no sound, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing, just me and the quiet. Maybe it was because I was so deep into the woods now, far from the trailhead with no one else in sight, but I felt a sudden unease crawl up my spine. It was like I wasn't supposed to be there. I brushed it off as just my mind getting the best of me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I took a deep breath and continued, trying to focus on the simple act of walking. The trail ahead of me stretched out in a winding path through dense trees and underbrush, the kind that looked both ancient and alive, like the forest itself was watching me. That's when I first saw the mark. It was carved into the bark of a tree, small and crude, almost like someone had done it with a knife or something sharp. It was an X, and it didn't seem to belong. It wasn't part of the trail markers I'd seen earlier. I stopped, my eyes narrowing as I inspected it. I'd read somewhere that people sometimes mark trails like this. Back in the old days, hikers and explorers used to carve symbols to guide each other. But this mark, this X, didn't feel like a sign of help. Felt like a warning. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to continue or turn back. But curiosity won out. I come this far, and I didn't want to lose my momentum. The trail was still clear ahead, and I figured it was just some odd, random marking from someone who'd been here before. But the further I went, the stranger things got. It wasn't the obvious things like strange noises or spooky shapes. No, it was more subtle than that. There were more marks, not always on trees, but sometimes on rocks or even on the dirt path itself. Some were crossed out, others were incomplete. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs, but I wasn't sure where it led. Every mark seemed to add to the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's just the isolation, the quiet, the unfamiliarity. But I couldn't shake the creeping sensation in my gut. At some point, the trail stopped being well-maintained. The well-trodden path became rocky, overgrown with weeds and brambles. The trees above grew denser, casting long shadows that made everything feel darker. My boots slipped on the uneven terrain, and I found myself having to duck beneath low branches. Still, I pressed on, convinced that this would all turn around soon. The trail would smooth out. I'd find my way back to civilization. Everything would be fine, but it didn't get better. In fact, it got worse. I was now deep in the woods, and I could barely see the sky through the thick canopy above. The trail was barely visible at times, and I had to rely on the map to make sure I was still on the right path. I felt my chest tightening, not from exertion, but from that gnawing feeling that I was being followed. I pulled out my map and checked my position. According to it, I was supposed to be nearing the end of this section of the trail, where it would loop back to the main path. I was looking for a marker to confirm it, but there was nothing, only trees. A slight sense of panic began to rise in my chest. I checked the map again. Maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere? No, I was on the right path. This didn't make sense. I decided to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable now. My footsteps seemed too loud in the silence, and every little sound, like the rustle of a distant animal, made me jump. The longer I walked, the more it felt like the woods were closing in around me. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. A faint crunch, like something stepping on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear. Nothing. Then a few seconds later, another crunch. and another. Whoever or whatever was out there was following me. I quickened my pace, trying not to make any noise. The crunching continued, staying just behind me, like it was mirroring my movements. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods felt suffocating now, the trees looming over me like giant sentinels. I needed to get out of there, but where was the trail? The map was no help anymore. The paths were all too twisted, too overgrown. My breath came faster, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the air, louder now, as if the forest was amplifying every noise I made. I tried to calm myself. It's nothing, I told myself. It's just an animal, a deer or something. But then it happened again. A loud crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, too close behind me. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. Just trees and the undergrowth, thick and untamed. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I kept moving, faster now, desperate to find any kind of sign that I was still on the right path. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw it, a clearing. I could see the sun, the open sky. There was hope. I pushed myself toward it, my muscles burning with the effort, until I stumbled out into the open. And that's when I saw the man. He was standing there on the far side of the clearing, watching me. He was tall, wearing a thick, dark jacket that seemed out of place in the wilderness. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his posture was unnerving, still rigid, like he'd been waiting for me. My heart dropped into my stomach. I froze in place, my mind racing for an explanation. Was this some other hiker? A ranger? No, something about the way he stood, the way he didn't move, it was wrong. I glanced around, looking for some way out, but the path behind me was already too thick with trees to return through. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I run? Before I could decide, he turned slowly, as if he'd been waiting for me to catch up. He walked away from the clearing, disappearing into the woods. For a long moment, I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of it. Was he a person? Was this some kind of trap? My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run in the opposite direction, but something held me in place. And then, without warning, I turned and ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't look back. The path was unclear now, and every step felt like a struggle, but I kept going. My body was screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop, not with the images of that man burning in my mind. I pushed through the pain, each breath a struggle, each step a battle against the fear that gripped me. I finally made it back to the main trail, the one I recognized. The sun was setting now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. I didn't care. I found my way out of the woods and back to the trailhead, my heart still racing, my body shaking with adrenaline. When I finally emerged from the trees and saw my car in the parking lot, I collapsed against it. I couldn't believe what had happened. I didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I had the sickening feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't speak to anyone about it. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I couldn't make sense of it, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to Oak Ridge. Not ever again. That trail, those woods, they weren't meant for me. And something or someone in those woods wanted me to know that. It was supposed to be an easy hike. I'd done it before several times and knew the terrain like the back of my hand. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, just a few miles through the woods, following a well-marked path up a hillside. It was one of those places that locals frequented, where the trees were thick and the air was fresh, but it was never overcrowded. Perfect for a solo hiker like me, just looking to clear my head. I arrived at the trailhead early, just after dawn. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that made me feel awake and alert, without being uncomfortable. I slipped my backpack on and checked my gear: water bottle, snacks, my phone for emergencies, not that I expected to need it, and a small first aid kit. I took a deep breath, looking up at the towering trees and the mist rising from the forest floor. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, idyllic even. The first part of the trail was the easiest. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles and the occasional rock, but nothing too treacherous. The trees above formed a canopy, letting dappled sunlight filter through, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Birds called to each other, their voices echoing between the trunks, and the only other sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind in the branches and my boots crunching along the path. As I walked, I let my mind wander, focusing on the rhythm of my steps, the steady rise and fall of my chest. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt balanced, right? No stress, no deadlines, no obligations. Just me and the quiet of the woods. About an hour into the hike, the trail began to slope upward. The forest thinned slightly, and the ground became rockier. My legs started to feel the burn as I pushed myself higher. I paused for a moment, sipping water from my bottle, scanning the surroundings. Nothing unusual, just a stretch of trees and rocks, a few scattered wildflowers in the underbrush. There was a trail marker up ahead, a small wooden sign nailed to a nearby tree, pointing the way forward. I continued on, my breath coming a bit harder now as the climb steepened. The trail was still clearly marked, but as I advanced, the woods began to feel denser. The trees stood closer together, their trunks darker and more gnarled. The air smelled different too, heavier, as if the forest had been waiting for something. I shook off the feeling, dismissing it as my imagination. It was just the natural progression of the hike. After all, every trail has its quieter, more isolated parts. The path started to narrow, and I had to pick my way more carefully. The rocks were loose in places, and the trail twisted, following the natural contours of the land. For a moment, I caught myself thinking about how few other hikers I had seen so far. It wasn't unusual, of course. This was a less traveled trail, but I hadn't passed anyone since I'd started. Felt almost too quiet, but I kept going, pushing through the doubts that had begun to creep in. Another hour passed, and I was now on the far side of the mountain, deeper into the woods. The trees had grown even denser, and the trail seemed less well-maintained. There were no longer the little signs I'd seen at the start, just faded markers on trees that could have been there for years. The woods around me were thick and silent. No birds, no insects. It was unnerving. I checked my watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed since I'd last stopped to take a break. I should have turned back by now, but something kept me moving forward. A feeling that I couldn't quite shake. A curiosity mixed with a touch of discomfort. The trail had become harder to follow, with the underbrush thickening. It was as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the space I was walking through. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe some old, overgrown structure. But as I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. It was an old cabin, half collapsed, its roof sagging. The windows were boarded up, the wood weathered and decayed. It was like it had been here for decades, abandoned long ago. I froze, my eyes scanning the building for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the eerie silence. Couldn't resist. I had to get closer. My curiosity pushed me forward, and I approached the cabin slowly, stepping over fallen branches and brush. As I neared the porch, I noticed something strange. Scratches on the doorframe. Deep gouges, as if something had tried to claw its way out. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to push the thought away. I was being ridiculous. It was just an old cabin, a forgotten relic of a time long past. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the cabin. The feeling that something was wrong had only deepened, but I couldn't pinpoint why. It was just a building, after all. There was no reason to be afraid. I took one last look at the structure before deciding to move on. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A faint noise, a rustling, not far off, maybe behind the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It was the sound of something moving, too deliberate to be the wind, too close to be an animal. I stood still, straining my ears. The noise stopped. Everything was quiet again. My thoughts raced. Could be nothing, I told myself. Just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, something small. I waited for a moment, but when I didn't hear anything more, I decided to keep moving. I resumed my hike, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my chest. The trail seemed even quieter now, and it felt like the trees were closing in on me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles, but it felt like every crack of a twig underfoot echoed in the stillness. Then something changed. I noticed that the trail ahead didn't look right. It was too overgrown, the path too faint. I stopped, my heart thudding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I pulled out my map, but it was no use. The trail wasn't listed here. This part of the forest wasn't on the map at all. I checked my phone, hoping for some sort of signal. Nothing. No bars. Not that I was expecting any, but the absence of service only added to the growing feeling of isolation. I turned around to retrace my steps, but the woods behind me looked different now. The trees were closer, their branches twisting unnaturally, blocking out the light. The path, once so clear, seemed to have disappeared. I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Panic began to creep in, but I shoved it down. I was just disoriented. I'd been here before, I reminded myself. I could handle this. I pushed forward, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were darker now, almost suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, like eyes were following my every move. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, but it didn't feel right. It was colder, sharper, carrying a scent that made my stomach churn. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The sun had been rising when I started, but now, hours later, the sky had dimmed, and I was no closer to the trailhead. My legs ached, my feet sore in my boots, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even remember why I was still moving forward. I stumbled over a rock, falling to my knees. When I looked up, there was a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a man, or what looked like one. He was tall, his features hidden beneath a thick beard and matted hair, his clothes worn and tattered. His eyes were wide, too wide, and they fixed on me with a gaze that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. It felt like an eternity before I managed to tear my eyes away and scramble to my feet. I didn't look back as I ran. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees pressing in tighter. I could hear my footsteps, my breathing, but nothing else. No rustling of leaves, no birds, no wind. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. I didn't stop running until I saw the clearing. The trailhead was just beyond it, a familiar sight that I almost couldn't believe. I staggered out of the woods, collapsing onto the dirt road that led back to the parking lot. When I looked behind me, the trees were just trees again. The path was clear, the forest ordinary. There was no cabin, no man, just the quiet of the woods. I didn't hike again for months after that. Even now, I avoid that area, and I tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But there's a part of me that knows better. Something was out there in those woods, something that doesn't belong. It was supposed to be a simple hike. A few miles, nothing too crazy, just a way to clear my head after a rough week. I was used to the woods. Hiking was something I did often, usually by myself. There's a peace you get from the solitude, the way your thoughts slow down with each step on the trail. The sun was high in the sky when I left the trailhead. I checked my phone for the time, about 10 a.m., so I had plenty of daylight. I was heading into a section of the forest I hadn't been to in a while, one that was a little more remote. The trail was marked, but not well traveled, just the way I liked it. The deeper I went, the fewer people I saw, until it felt like I was the only one there. First, the hike was calming. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the rustle of leaves in the trees above. The forest smelled of pine, damp earth, and fresh air. There's something about being out in nature that makes you feel alive, like you're part of something bigger, something ancient. I hadn't planned on going off trail, but somewhere along the way, the main path split. One trail veered left, heading up the side of a small mountain. The other continued straight. I debated for a second, but the idea of getting a good view from the top tempted me. I hadn't planned to make it a big adventure, but the pull of a new perspective was hard to resist. I turned left. The path grew steeper, the ground more uneven. It didn't feel like the well-maintained trails I was used to. The more I climbed, the less I saw of any other signs of human presence. The occasional trail marker, a faded arrow on a post, or a scrap of old tape tied to a tree were the only reminders that this path was once cared for. But there was something odd about the air, a slight heaviness, like it was holding on to something I couldn't see. Maybe it was just the quiet, but it made my skin prickle. The higher I went, the harder it became to keep my footing. Loose rocks, thick roots pushing through the earth, and steep inclines made each step more difficult. But I kept going, determined to reach the top. It wasn't like I had anywhere to be. The view would be worth it, I told myself. The wind picked up as I neared the summit. It wasn't enough to be dangerous, but it tugged at my jacket, the chill brushing against my neck. The trees were fewer up here, scattered in patches, giving way to a rocky outcrop that offered a perfect view of the valley below. It was a sight that made the struggle worthwhile. The green expanse of the forest, the distant hills, and the sprawling sky above. I stayed up there for a while, enjoying the peace, breathing in the fresh, cool air. I checked my phone again, no signal, of course. Not that I expected it. I'd made the decision to go off the grid for a while, and the lack of connection felt oddly freeing. But after a bit, I realized something. It was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind either. Felt like the world had pressed pause. There were no birds calling, no insects buzzing. The wind, which had been rustling through the trees only moments ago, had died down completely. It wasn't just the absence of sound that bothered me, though. It was the feeling, the kind of sensation you get when you're being watched. But there's no one there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone out here. The feeling might just be a result of the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to start heading back down. I wasn't in any rush, but the thought of lingering on that exposed ridge for too long wasn't comforting. As I made my way back down the path, I realized something strange. The trail was different now. Felt wrong. The way the trees bent, the way the light filtered through the leaves, it was all off. It was as if the landscape had subtly shifted while I wasn't paying attention. The path that had seemed so clear on the way up now seemed confusing, disorienting. There were more rocks, more debris on the ground. The trail markers had become scarce, and the ones I did see were faded, almost like they had been there for years, ignored by everyone. The trees around me had thickened, their trunks gnarled and twisted, the branches reaching out like fingers. I paused and looked around, trying to get my bearings. No signs of other hikers, no signs of any humans for that matter. I checked my watch, 1:30 p.m. I had been hiking for about 3.5 hours. It felt like more, like I'd lost track of time somehow. That's when the first real pang of panic hit me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a trail marker. I wasn't lost, though, not yet. I just had to keep walking and I'd find my way back. But then I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a sign, one of those old wooden ones that used to be on every trailhead. The letters were weathered and chipped, but I could still make out the name of the trail. It didn't match any of the trail names I had seen on the maps at the trailhead earlier. I stared at it for a moment, trying to piece it together. How had I missed this trail? Was it one that branched off earlier and I hadn't noticed? I was sure I'd been paying attention. I was confused now. The feeling that something wasn't right deepened. I turned to look back down the path I had just walked. The trees seemed to close in behind me. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm. The more I walked, the more lost I felt. Every turn seemed to lead me in circles. The trees around me looked almost identical, the underbrush thick and tangled, like the forest itself was trapping me. The sky was clouding over, and the air had a dampness to it that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the panic creeping up on me, but I forced myself to slow down. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I didn't know how long I'd been walking at that point. Maybe an hour, maybe longer. Time was becoming irrelevant. Every step felt like I was digging myself deeper into something I couldn't get out of. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My heart pounded harder with each step, and the feeling of isolation became unbearable. Then something caught my eye. It was a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the shadows of the trees creating an illusion. But no, it was a person. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see movement, someone walking in the same direction I was. Relief washed over me for a moment. Fellow hiker. I wasn't alone. But as I took a few more steps, I realized something that froze me in my tracks. The figure wasn't getting any closer. I should have been able to catch up, but it stayed just far enough away. It moved steadily, like it was walking at a normal pace, but no matter how fast or slow I went, I couldn't close the distance between us. My stomach churned. I was being led. There was no other explanation. I stopped. The figure didn't stop. Kept walking, but still didn't get closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow toying with me. The trees around me began to feel more oppressive. My mind was racing. Was it another hiker or something else? Why was it moving so slowly? What was it leading me toward? The panic came back with a vengeance, flooding my chest. My breathing quickened, my throat dry. Finally, I had had enough. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks, adrenaline pumping through my veins, urging my legs to move faster. The forest seemed to close in on me, but I kept running. The sound of my heartbeat drowned out all other noise. I couldn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt like something was following. I knew I couldn't let up, couldn't slow down. When I finally burst out of the trees, I didn't know where I was. I didn't recognize the area, but it didn't matter. I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of that forest. I kept running until I found the trailhead again, my breath ragged, my legs weak from the effort. It wasn't until I stopped that I realized how close I had come to losing it. The woods had been a maze, one that I wasn't meant to navigate. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. It was over. I was out, and I'd never go back. I had always enjoyed the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and being alone in the forest gave me a strange sense of peace. But that Saturday morning, when I set off for the hike through the dense woods, something felt different. It wasn't that anything specific had changed. The weather was typical for the time of year, the air was crisp, and the trail was well worn, like it had been for years. But there was a quiet unease that settled into me as soon as I parked my car at the base of the mountain. I checked my gear, making sure everything was in order. I had a light backpack with enough water, some trail mix, and a map that I had printed off the internet. My boots were laced up tight, and the weight of the pack felt comfortable. I was ready for the hike, or so I thought. I set out along the trail, my steps crunching over the dirt and fallen leaves. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. Normally, there would be the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But today, everything seemed still, almost unnervingly so. I shook it off as the result of being early in the morning, but that didn't quite settle my nerves. The first couple of miles went by without incident. The trail was easy to follow, winding through thick pines and occasional bursts of open sunlight. I lost myself in the rhythm of my steps, the sound of my breath, the way the cool air filled my lungs, and the steady thud of my boots on the path. But then, something changed. It wasn't the sound, it was more like the absence of sound. There was no warning, no sudden snap or rustle in the leaves. It just became silent, as though all the life around me had gone still, holding its breath. I stopped, unsure of why I had this sudden feeling of discomfort creeping up my spine. I looked around, expecting something, anything, to explain this shift, but there was nothing. I kept walking, though, thinking I was just overreacting. The trail narrowed here, with the trees growing taller and the sunlight less frequent, but I continued. This was a familiar hike, one I'd done at least 3 times before, and I knew it like the back of my hand. At least I thought I did. Then the trail turned sharply to the right. I remembered this section from previous hikes, the way the trees bent over the path like archways. It was beautiful, but this time, as I stepped forward, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was a strange sensation, not something you can easily explain. It was as though something or someone was observing me from just beyond my sight, just out of reach. I paused for a moment, looking around. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but there was no movement in the underbrush. Still, the hairs on my neck stood up. I checked my map, but it didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. The trail was clear, heading up the mountain, following the same path as always. I shrugged it off and continued, hoping I was just imagining things. I needed to reach the summit where there was a small overlook. It was my goal for the day, my reward for the hike. A quiet spot to sit and think. I hadn't realized how much time had passed, but by the time I reached the halfway point, I noticed the sky had started to cloud over. The sun was hidden behind the growing clouds, and the air felt heavier now, the atmosphere thick with humidity. I took a swig of water and adjusted the strap on my backpack. Just as I started walking again, I noticed a faint smell. It was subtle at first, a musty, earthy odor that I couldn't place. I paused, sniffing the air, but couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't overwhelming either. It just lingered, like the forest itself was exhaling something strange. I pushed on, determined to make it to the overlook, but the trail was becoming less familiar. I couldn't explain why, but the markers I had seen on past hikes were missing. The wooden signposts that had once guided me now seemed faint and worn, as though they'd been tampered with. It was as if someone or something had been trying to erase the trail. I was no longer sure where I was going. The path began to curve, heading off in a direction I didn't recall. I felt the panic start to rise in my chest, but I fought it down. I wasn't lost. I was just off the main trail, that's all. I had only taken one wrong turn. I retraced my steps, looking for any familiar landmarks, anything that could tell me I was on the right track. But that's when I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. I hadn't seen any trail markers at all for the last half mile. I stopped in my tracks, standing perfectly still as I surveyed my surroundings. The trees had closed in around me, their trunks thicker and older, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The trail was no longer a clear path, but a series of barely distinguishable footsteps leading deeper into the forest. And then, without thinking, I turned around to retrace my steps again. But the path behind me wasn't the same. It didn't look like the way I had come at all. I was no longer sure which direction I had been heading, and the dread that had been gnawing at me slowly grew into full-blown fear. I didn't want to panic, but it was hard not to as I began to feel the weight of my isolation. I couldn't call for help. I had no signal here. No one knew where I was. I was alone in a part of the forest that felt strangely off, like something was wrong. I decided to keep walking, trusting that I could find my way back. But the trees seemed to move, their branches stretching out as if to swallow the path. The ground beneath my feet grew uneven, and each step felt like it took me further away from any sense of safety. The smell was stronger now, the air thick with rot and decay. It was unbearable, almost suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering in my chest as I pushed forward. I couldn't think straight anymore. The forest was closing in on me, and with every step I took, I felt more disoriented, like I was walking in circles, trapped. I stumbled through the underbrush, pushing through thickets of brambles and low-hanging branches. The sky above had grown darker, and what little light filtered through the trees now had an eerie, dim quality to it. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, and I knew I had to make a decision. And then, just when I thought I might have completely lost my bearings, I saw it, a small clearing ahead. Relief washed over me in an instant, but I wasn't sure why. There was something about the clearing that felt different. The trees around it were gnarled and twisted, the ground beneath my feet soft and damp, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. I stepped forward cautiously, feeling the wet earth squelch beneath my boots. And then, I saw the most unnerving thing. A small pile of stones, stacked carefully in the center of the clearing. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another sign of human presence in the woods. But something about the way they were arranged made my stomach churn. They weren't just a random stack. They had been placed deliberately. It wasn't just a pile. It was like a marker, like a warning. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and run, but I couldn't. Something was compelling me to stay, to figure out what was going on. But the moment I stepped closer to the stones, I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A snap like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze, heart in my throat. I wasn't alone. It started off as just another hike. I've always loved the mountains, the quiet of the trees, and the solitude that only nature can offer. A weekend alone, away from the noise of the world, was something I'd been looking forward to for weeks. I'd planned this trip for months, an easy trek up one of the less traveled trails in the foothills near my town. I'd been to the area plenty of times, so I knew the route pretty well. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: water, a couple of sandwiches, some trail mix, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my map. I didn't think I needed much else. It wasn't a particularly challenging hike, but I always over-prepared. My boots were worn in just right, and the weather was perfect for a hike. Sunny, but not too hot. It seemed like the ideal day to be out on the trails. The trailhead was easy to find, tucked just off a small dirt road. There were only a few cars parked in the lot when I arrived, so I knew I wouldn't be dealing with crowds. I gave a quick nod to a couple leaving as I arrived, then slung my pack over my shoulder and started up the trail. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail wound through a dense forest of pine trees. The ground was soft underfoot, with a few patches of muddy trail where the snowmelt had lingered a bit too long. I didn't mind, it felt like a good workout. The air smelled fresh, the kind of earthy scent you can only get from untouched nature. About an hour into the hike, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't much, just a faint sound behind me. I paused, listening. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a rustling sound, like someone or something moving just out of sight. But when I stopped and turned around, I didn't see anything. No other hikers. The path was empty. I figured I was just being paranoid. It was easy to let your mind wander when you were out alone in the woods, far from civilization. So, I continued, trying to focus on the sound of my feet crunching over the gravel and fallen pine needles. The trail had begun to climb gently, and the trees thinned out as I neared the ridge. From here, I could see the valley below, a patchwork of green and brown fields stretching out. The view was spectacular. It always made the effort worth it. I stopped for a quick break, taking a sip of water and munching on some of the trail mix. That's when I heard it again, a faint rustling. This time it was much clearer. It wasn't just the wind, it was a deliberate movement. Something or someone was following me. My heart started to race. I glanced over my shoulder again. There was no one there, just the endless stretch of trail behind me, the thick trees on either side. I shook my head. I was being ridiculous. There were other hikers on this trail, after all. But the thought of someone being so close, following without making any noise, unsettled me. I hurried my pace, but it didn't help. The rustling continued, staying just behind me, at a distance but never quite out of earshot. It wasn't like someone was trying to be sneaky. It was as if they were walking at the same pace I was, matching my steps with perfect synchronization. I stopped again, my mind racing. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. I started walking again, faster this time. The sound behind me increased as well, just as if whatever was there had sped up to match my pace. My breath quickened. Every part of me wanted to turn around, but I didn't. I wasn't sure if it would make things worse. The last thing I needed was to confront whatever it was in the middle of nowhere. At that point, I knew I was getting close to a small clearing, a place where the trail opened up to a few rocks and a view of the mountains. I figured that if I could make it to that spot, I might feel a little safer, at least with a wider view of my surroundings. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the way my legs burned. I just wanted to reach the clearing and get some space. The sound behind me matched my frantic steps. Whatever it was had picked up its pace as well. Finally, I reached the clearing, but the relief I had expected never came. I took a quick glance over my shoulder and, for the first time, I saw something. It wasn't a person. It was a figure, moving quickly between the trees, staying just outside my line of sight, like a shadow flitting just beyond the range of my vision. I could hear the rustling, now louder, closer. It was a person, no doubt about it, but they were moving like they were trying to stay hidden, darting between the trees, never fully appearing in my view. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? And why were they following me like this? No one else had passed me on the trail since I started. I reached for my flashlight and my phone, but I didn't dare turn them on yet. The last thing I needed was to draw attention. I knew I couldn't just stand there. If this person had bad intentions, I wasn't going to be able to outrun them on foot. So, I made a snap decision to climb up the rocks in the clearing. If I could get higher, I might be able to see better and at least gain some distance between me and the figure. I scrambled up the rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. Once I reached the top, I looked around, hoping to spot the figure. There was no movement for a few seconds, just the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it, I saw the figure again. It was moving slower now, as though it had seen me climb. It was creeping along the edge of the clearing, staying just outside the tree line, watching me. I knew I couldn't just wait there forever. I needed to get moving, but where? The trail wasn't far behind me, but I didn't want to go back that way, back toward the figure. I had no idea if it was alone or if there were more people out there. Instead, I decided to make a break for it. There was another trail a few miles up ahead, one I had only hiked once before. It wasn't well marked, but it cut across the ridgeline and eventually looped back to the main trail further along. I gathered my stuff quickly, took one last glance around the clearing, and bolted for the side trail. It wasn't easy to find, and I stumbled over loose rocks and uneven ground, my heart pounding in my ears. My only thought was to get off the main path. The sounds behind me were still there, but now I could only hear the occasional rustle, not the steady pace that had been keeping up with me earlier. I hoped I had shaken whatever it was. I moved as quickly as I dared, adrenaline pushing me through the dense brush. After what felt like an eternity, I found the side trail. It was barely visible, just a faint indent in the earth, barely wide enough to walk on comfortably. I wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but it was better than staying where I was. The trail wound higher into the mountains, the trees thickening as I went. I was starting to calm down a bit, though my mind was still racing. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, but the sounds had stopped. Maybe I had outrun whatever it was. Finally, after what felt like hours, I made it to a small ridge where the trail leveled out. The trees parted, and for the first time since I'd noticed the figure, I felt safe. The view from here was beautiful. Rolling hills, a few scattered farms far below, and the sun starting to dip lower in the sky, painting everything in warm golds and reds. I paused, breathing heavily, and looked around. There was no sign of the figure anymore.
No rustling, no footsteps.
Just the quiet peace of the mountains. I didn't dare go back to the main trail. Instead, I decided to follow the side trail until it looped back to the parking lot. It was the long way, but I figured it was safer. The last thing I needed was to run into whoever or whatever had been following me. As I made my way down the side trail, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I had made it. No one had caught up to me. I was finally safe. When I reached the parking lot, the sun had set. The parking lot was empty except for my car. I was exhausted, but relieved. I'd made it out. Whatever had happened on that trail, I was done with it. And just as I was about to get into my car, I saw something in the rearview mirror, a shadow in the trees at the edge of the parking lot. I turned, but it was gone. Just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. I didn't care. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away. Whatever it was, I never wanted to think about it again. But I knew one thing for sure: I'd never go hiking alone again. I've always been the type of person who enjoys a good hike. The kind where you're far away from everything and everyone. Just you and the trees, the dirt underfoot, and the silence that feels like it wraps around you like a warm blanket. That was the kind of escape I craved, and lately, I had been feeling like I needed it more than usual. Life had been chaotic. Work, family stuff, you name it, and I just wanted to get away for a while. So, I decided to take a solo hike on a trail I'd heard about online. Nothing too extreme, just a few hours into the wilderness and back. Peaceful day. At least that's what I thought when I started. The trail was supposed to be well-marked and safe, a popular route for day hikers, especially during this time of year when the weather was just starting to turn. I woke up early that morning, packed my backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a lightweight jacket. It was a typical hike for me. I grabbed my boots, laced them up tight, and set out before the sun was fully up. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled fresh with the earth still damp from the night's dew. When I got to the trailhead, I noticed a few cars parked around, but it wasn't crowded. The kind of perfect balance where you know other people are around, but not so close that it feels like you're in a busy park. I was looking forward to being alone in nature, but not to the point of feeling unsafe. I double-checked my map, making sure I knew where I was headed, and began walking. The first stretch of the trail was easy, a well-worn path that twisted through thick woods. The sunlight barely pierced through the trees, casting everything in dappled shadows. Birds chirped overhead, and I could hear the sound of a nearby stream burbling over rocks. It was the kind of noise that made you feel at ease. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving me in my own little bubble. There was something calming about being surrounded by so much greenery, the only movement coming from the rustling of leaves and the occasional critter scurrying across the path. I let my mind wander as I walked, thinking about everything and nothing at all. I don't know when the air started to feel heavier, but at some point, I noticed it. It wasn't a physical weight, more of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The quiet, peaceful sounds of the forest seemed to die down just a bit. The birds that had been chirping so loudly earlier had stopped. Even the wind had died, leaving only the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt trail. I wasn't exactly sure why, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked in quiet forests like this. Maybe it was just a weird moment, something that would pass. I kept moving forward, telling myself it was nothing. As I pushed further into the woods, I passed a few trail markers. The route was still clear, and I had no trouble staying on the path. But then something strange happened. I looked down at my map, trying to get my bearings, and realized I'd passed a trail marker. I hadn't noticed it at first, and I felt a bit of unease settle in my chest. How had I missed it? I retraced my steps, scanning the trees around me. I couldn't find the marker. It didn't make sense. I knew I had been following the path correctly, but now I was starting to feel lost. I tried to shake off the creeping anxiety. I'd been hiking for years. I knew better than to let myself get disoriented like this. But something about the way the trees seemed to press in around me, the way the light was dimming even though it was only mid-morning, made me feel like I wasn't alone in these woods anymore. It was subtle at first, like a tug in the back of my mind that said something was off. Something wasn't right. I stopped walking for a moment, standing still on the path. I looked around at the trees, their trunks so thick they looked like sentinels, their branches heavy with leaves that seemed to form a canopy above me. The air felt colder now, even though it hadn't changed in temperature. I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from something else. I checked my map again. I had veered off course. I wasn't on the trail anymore. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. How long had I been walking in the wrong direction? I couldn't remember when I'd started to drift, but now I was far enough off the path that I couldn't just turn back and hope to find my way. I didn't want to panic. That would only make things worse. Instead, I started to retrace my steps slowly, trying to find some sign of where I had gone wrong. But as I walked, the path seemed to blur. The trees didn't look familiar anymore. I knew I was on the right trail before, but now it was as if the woods had rearranged themselves, hiding everything that would lead me back to where I started. I had no idea how much time had passed. Hours? Minutes? It didn't matter. I was starting to feel a sense of urgency. I needed to find my way back, and fast. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and the woods, which had once felt like a welcoming refuge, now felt oppressive. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, nearly imperceptible sound, like the crunch of leaves underfoot or a branch being nudged. I paused, my heart racing. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or if it was something else. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I wasn't alone. My eyes scanned the woods around me, looking for any sign of movement. But all I saw were trees, their branches twisting high above me like skeletal hands. I felt like I was being watched. It was an unsettling feeling, one that made my skin crawl and my muscles tense. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I started walking again, faster now, my footsteps quick and heavy as I tried to pick up my pace. But the woods weren't making it easy. The trail was no longer clear. The ground was uneven, and the trees seemed to close in around me with each step I took. I wasn't just lost anymore. I was starting to feel like I was being led deeper into the forest, as if the woods themselves were guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I don't know how long I walked like that, heart pounding in my chest, desperately trying to make sense of the path in front of me. The woods felt claustrophobic, the air thick with an unsettling quiet. The feeling of being watched never left me. Finally, I stumbled across a small clearing. The sunlight, which had been dimming all around me, seemed to break through the clouds for a moment. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I hadn't realized how tense I had become. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was just exhausted and overthinking everything. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. When I opened them, I saw something I can't explain. It was a flash just for a second, but it was enough to freeze me in place. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just standing there watching me. Couldn't make out any details. The figure was too far away, too shrouded in shadows. But the feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed by fear, unsure whether to approach or run. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped into the shadows again, disappearing from view. I didn't wait to see where it went. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the sharp pain in my legs and the burning in my chest. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods. My mind was in a frenzy, images flashing through it, of the figure, of the strange noises, of everything that had felt wrong. Finally, after what seemed like hours of running, I burst out of the woods and back onto the main trail. I was gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me, and I didn't stop until I saw the trailhead, the parking lot, the safety of civilization. I sat down on a bench, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself down. I didn't know what had happened out there. I didn't know if it had been real or if I had just gotten lost and let my imagination get the best of me. But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't going back into those woods. Not alone. Not ever again. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth, the kind of scent that only comes after a night of rain. I was standing at the edge of the trailhead, the mountains towering in front of me. A quiet hum in the back of my mind told me that this was going to be an experience I wouldn't forget. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I'd done it before many times, in fact. It was just a few miles up to the ridge, a scenic view at the top, and then back down. Nothing too complicated. But for some reason, today felt different. Maybe it was the rain from the night before, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, threatening more. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and started down the trail. The earth beneath my boots was still soft and slick, a reminder of the rainstorm that had passed through. My footsteps were the only sound, apart from the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves in the trees. The first mile was easy. The trail wound through thick forest, tall trees stretching up, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Everything looked normal, peaceful, even. The woods were dense, but familiar. I had hiked here countless times before, and nothing about the scenery made me feel uneasy. As I moved forward, though, I started noticing small things, details I hadn't paid attention to before. The trees seemed older, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like they'd been standing here for centuries. The path was narrower than I remembered, almost as if the forest was reclaiming it. The deeper I went, the more the light from the overcast sky seemed to fade, as if the clouds were closing in, tightening around me. I stopped to take a quick break, leaning against a moss-covered rock. The forest was quieter now, almost unnervingly so. No birds, no wind, not even the occasional rustle of leaves. Just an oppressive silence. I glanced back down the trail. The way I'd come still looked normal, no signs of anything unusual. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was just my imagination. But something was definitely different today. I pushed the thought aside and kept walking. The trail started to ascend more steeply, the trees becoming less dense and more spaced out. The ground was getting harder to navigate, with loose rocks and roots threatening to trip me up. I had to watch my step more carefully now, and the constant sound of my boots crunching against gravel filled the silence. A few hours passed. I wasn't quite at the top yet, but I was getting closer. I could feel the weight of the hike settling into my legs. My muscles burned with each step, but I welcomed it. It was a familiar, comforting feeling, one that told me I was accomplishing something. But then, I noticed something strange, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks and scanned the woods. Nothing. I strained my ears, hoping to hear a noise, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint rustling of wind through the trees. I shook my head. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel. Still, I couldn't help but feel a slight unease creep in. I took a deep breath and continued upward, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like something was watching me, something just out of sight, just out of reach. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but each time, there was nothing there. Another hour passed, and the trail began to level out. I was almost at the ridge now, the summit just a short distance ahead. My body ached from the climb, but I was determined to finish. I had come this far after all. And then, just as I thought I was getting closer to the top, the trail split. One path veered off to the left, heading deeper into the woods, while the other continued upward. I stood there, staring at the fork in the trail. Normally, I would have taken the familiar route straight ahead. But today, I don't know why, something made me want to explore the other path. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling that something had drawn me that way. But I took the left path. It wasn't long before the woods closed in around me again. The trees were thick here, the trail narrow, and the air felt heavier, thicker. The quiet was even more pronounced now, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. The path twisted and turned, winding through the dense forest, and I began to notice something strange about the trees. They weren't just old. They were twisted, their trunks curving in unnatural angles. It was like the forest itself was contorting, as if it didn't want me here. I stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the trees, my heart beginning to beat faster. Something was definitely wrong. I could feel it now, a primal sense of danger creeping up from the pit of my stomach. My instincts were telling me to turn back, but I couldn't, not yet. I had to keep going, had to see this through. I moved forward, faster now, my boots crunching against the dead leaves and branches on the ground. The farther I went, the more the trees seemed to close in on me. I felt trapped, like the forest was deliberately guiding me deeper and deeper into its heart. Then I saw it, a structure. It was a small cabin, barely visible through the trees, its roof sagging and covered in moss. I couldn't remember there ever being a cabin along this trail. I had hiked here so many times, and I was sure I would have noticed something like this before. I hesitated, standing just outside the clearing where the cabin sat. The door was slightly ajar, the wood rotting and covered in mildew. It looked abandoned, decaying, but even in its dilapidated state, I felt drawn to it. The curiosity, the pull, was stronger now. I knew I shouldn't go any closer, but my legs carried me forward, as if something was controlling me. I reached the door and pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air stale and thick with the smell of mold. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light, and as I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop. The silence in here was suffocating. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong, like it hadn't been touched by anyone in years. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could hear the distant sound of something moving, something outside. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind, or if it was something else, something watching me. I turned to leave. That's when I saw it. A mark on the wall, barely visible at first, but as my eyes adjusted, it became clearer. A series of strange symbols, carved into the wood, deep enough that they couldn't be easily erased. I traced them with my finger, my breath shallow, a chill creeping down my spine. They were unsettling, like a warning I didn't fully understand but felt deep in my gut. That's when I heard it. Something behind me, a noise in the woods, too faint to identify. But it wasn't the wind. No, it was something else. I didn't know what it was, but it was coming closer, fast. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. I ran out of the cabin, the door slamming behind me with an unnatural thud. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sprinted back down the trail. I didn't know what was chasing me, but I couldn't bring myself to stop and find out. The trees seemed to blur as I ran, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Every step felt heavier, the path more treacherous. The branches scraped at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes or it could have been hours. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to get out of the woods. When the forest finally started to open up again, I slowed down, gasping for breath. I stumbled out into the clearing where the trail split. The familiar path to the right beckoned me, and without a second thought, I took it. The trail up to the ridge was still there, waiting for me. I didn't stop until I reached the top, my legs trembling, my mind racing. When I finally stood at the summit, looking out over the valley below, I felt the weight of everything I'd just experienced. The panic, the fear, the dread that had been building up in me since I'd veered off the main trail. I looked back at the woods. The sky had cleared slightly, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The forest was still quiet, peaceful, nothing like the chaos I had just run from. I sat on a rock, breathing deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't know what had happened back there. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something in the woods I had disturbed? The thought lingered, but it didn't matter anymore. I had made it out. And as I sat there, the cool breeze against my skin, the sun on my face, I realized one thing. Sometimes, nature doesn't give you answers. It just shows you what it's capable of. And sometimes you just have to trust that you're lucky enough to make it out in one piece. I didn't plan on it being anything special. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike, just me, my backpack, and the forest, a way to clear my head. It had been a rough couple of weeks. Work was exhausting, and I just needed to get away from it all. The weather was perfect, sunny, not too hot, a slight breeze rustling the leaves. The kind of day you think would be nothing but peaceful. I should have known better. I parked my car at the trailhead, feeling that familiar sense of excitement that comes with the start of a journey. The kind where, deep down, you're about to experience something that feels different from the everyday routine. I grabbed my pack, adjusted the straps over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was well marked at first, a dirt path through towering trees, the sound of my boots crunching on the loose rocks beneath me. As I walked, the sun filtered through the branches above, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Everything felt calm, my breathing steady, the rhythm of my steps in sync with the natural sounds around me. I had done this trail before several years ago. It was a loop, a moderate hike that looped through some stunning viewpoints and dense woods. It was well-traveled but not overly crowded, the kind of place where you could still find solitude if you were lucky enough to get away from the main rush. I remembered how amazing the views were, the way the landscape opened up at the top of the ridge and you could see miles of green, the mountains in the distance. It was one of those places that felt like an escape from everything. The first part of the hike was easy. The terrain was smooth, the path winding gently upwards, nothing too challenging. I'd stop every so often to take in the scenery, adjust my pack, and drink some water. The whole thing was calm, peaceful. But as I continued, something started to feel off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air had grown heavier as I climbed higher, the trees denser. It wasn't particularly hot, but it felt thick, almost suffocating. I wasn't sweating too much, but I could feel the slight pressure building in my chest, like the forest was closing in on me. I pushed the feeling aside and kept moving, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After a while, the trail started to narrow. The dirt was replaced by rocks and roots, forcing me to watch where I stepped more carefully. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo louder now, like I was hearing them from farther away. It was odd because there was no one else on the trail. No one had passed me, and I hadn't passed anyone either. I would have expected to see another hiker at some point, but there was no sign of anyone. The trees were taller now, their trunks thick and gnarled, their leaves forming a thick canopy overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. The path twisted through this dense wood, and the air seemed to grow colder. I zipped up my jacket, my mind now more alert, my senses sharpening as I tried to make sense of the strange stillness surrounding me. The only sound now was the faint rustling of the leaves and my own breathing, which seemed oddly loud in the silence. I paused, feeling a slight unease in my stomach. A deep breath didn't help. My instincts were telling me something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain why. It was just a gut feeling, that primal warning that something was off. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. There was nothing, no animals, no other hikers, just the same dark woods stretching endlessly ahead. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. Maybe I was just paranoid, but the deeper I went, the more it seemed to creep in, the feeling that something was waiting, watching. The woods here were different from the open spaces I'd been in earlier. The trees grew closer together, their roots weaving through the ground, making the trail twist and turn unpredictably. The sun barely reached the ground anymore, leaving the forest floor dark and shadowed. I took another step forward, the sound of my boots crunching on the earth the only thing breaking the quiet. But then I heard something else, a snap. A twig breaking just behind me. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees and shadows, stretching far behind me. Maybe it was just a deer, or an animal. Maybe just the wind. But the snap had been too loud, too distinct. I continued walking, but now I was listening harder. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of the branches seemed to carry a weight to it. A sense of urgency began to build in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something isn't right but can't put your finger on what exactly it is. It wasn't long before the trail started to get steeper. I had to work harder to climb, the rocks and loose dirt challenging my footing. My hands gripped the nearest tree for support as I pulled myself up, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The cold that had settled into the air earlier had now turned into a biting chill, and I was wishing I had packed another layer. That's when I heard it again. A sound, this time louder. A soft, deliberate crunching of leaves behind me. My heart skipped. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I needed to know. But when I did, nothing. There was still no one there. I took a deep breath. Stay calm. It was nothing. I was just imagining things. But as I kept moving, it wasn't just the sounds that unsettled me. It was the weight of the silence that followed every movement I made. The way the air seemed to close in around me. I felt like I was being hunted. Every glance over my shoulder made me more aware of the space behind me, of the growing sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was following me, just out of sight. My mind raced as I quickened my pace. The path twisted and turned, and the trees grew thicker, their branches blocking out more light. I was almost at the ridge now, I thought. The viewpoint wasn't far off. If I could get there, I'd have a clear view. I'd be able to see what was going on, maybe spot someone else on the trail, maybe get a sense of safety. But when I reached the top, the ridge wasn't what I expected. Instead of an open clearing with a view, it was another dense cluster of trees, even darker than the ones below. The trail here seemed to split into several directions. No clear signs of where to go. I stepped closer, my nerves on edge, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, not making a sound. I could make out the shape of a person, tall, hunched slightly, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my stomach twisted into knots. I should have turned around then, should have run back down the trail, but I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted to the spot, as if my body didn't want to move. The figure didn't move, but it didn't have to. It was enough to see it there, standing motionless, watching. I took one more step, then another. The figure remained still, and I felt an odd pull, like I was drawn to it. I shouldn't have, but I did. I kept walking toward it, my feet carrying me despite every warning in my mind. And just as I got within a few yards, the figure slowly turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the shadows like smoke. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I sprinted down the trail, my legs moving on their own, pumping as fast as I could. The trees blurred around me, the ground uneven, but I didn't care. I could hear footsteps behind me now. There was no mistaking it. Someone was chasing me, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I don't know how long it took before I burst back into the clearing, where the trail opened up again. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, my heart pounding. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, but I didn't care. I was out of the woods. I didn't stop until I was safely back at my car, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine, not looking back, not daring to. And when I finally drove away, I kept my eyes on the road ahead, never glancing at the trees lining the trailhead. I never found out who or what that figure was. But I'll tell you this, I won't be going back to that trail, ever. Something in those woods isn't right, and I have no intention of finding out what it is. I set off on my solo hike early in the morning, the first light of dawn just barely spilling over the horizon. The trail I had chosen was known for being remote and quiet, far away from the crowds of popular parks. The forest around me was thick and dense, the trees tall and their trunks almost black in the cool morning light. The path was narrow, covered in thick layers of leaves and roots that twisted up from the ground like natural traps. It was a perfect day for a hike, the kind where you can smell the fresh, damp earth and hear every sound of the forest coming alive. I had planned this hike for weeks. I didn't usually go on trips like this, deep in the woods, far from any sort of civilization, but something had drawn me to it. I didn't expect anything dramatic to happen. Maybe I just wanted to be alone for a while, away from the noise of the city, away from people. The hike was supposed to be an escape, nothing more. I had mapped out the route carefully, checked the weather, packed everything I thought I would need: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a compass, even though the trail was supposed to be well marked. The first couple of hours were quiet. I was completely alone out there, with only the sound of my boots crunching against the dry leaves beneath me and the occasional bird call echoing from somewhere deep in the trees. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the light faded, even though the sky above was still clear and bright. The thick canopy of trees blocked the sunlight, leaving the ground in a soft, dim glow. I found it oddly peaceful, like I was the only one in the world. I came to a small creek that ran through the woods, its water sparkling in the patches of sunlight that managed to sneak through the leaves. The sound of the water was soothing, almost hypnotic. I stopped to take a break, sat on a rock by the edge of the creek, and took out my water bottle. The air was cool, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves above. As I drank, I let my mind wander, thinking about how nice it was to be away from everything, to have this quiet moment all to myself. But then there was something off. A sound. It was faint at first, like a crack of a twig snapping, just barely loud enough for me to hear over the water. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't move, just listened. It was so quiet after that sound. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else. I stared at the trees across the creek, waiting for a sign, but nothing moved.
No birds, no rustling.
The forest felt still, too still. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal I couldn't see, or my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That creeping sense that you get when you're alone in a place you know you shouldn't be, like you've crossed some invisible line. I stayed sitting there for a moment longer than I probably should have, then decided to get back on the trail. The thought of being too far from the safety of the main path unsettled me, even though the trail was well established. Still, the deeper into the forest I went, the more uneasy I felt. I picked up my pace, and the dense forest began to give way to a more open area, where the trees were spaced farther apart, and the underbrush was less thick. The path curved around a large boulder and continued upward into a small hill. As I reached the top, I could see a valley below, the treetops stretching out for miles in every direction. The sight should have been awe-inspiring, but instead, it made my chest tighten. It felt as if the land was watching me, every tree and rock somehow alive, every inch of it familiar, but strange at the same time. I stood there for a long time, staring into the valley, before the silence of the place began to feel suffocating, and I turned to continue my hike. It was then that I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, deer maybe, or a wild boar, but they were strange. They didn't look right. The edges of the tracks were too sharp, too defined, like something had been dragging itself across the ground. I bent down to get a closer look, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. The tracks led off the trail into the woods. They seemed fresh too, just made, almost. The dirt around them was still slightly disturbed. My instinct told me to turn around, go back to the main trail, head to the exit, and forget about the whole thing. But there was something inside me, curiosity maybe, that told me to follow them. Maybe it was the solitude of the hike, or maybe I was just desperate for something to break the monotony. But I found myself stepping off the path, following the strange tracks deeper into the woods. As I walked, the woods seemed to grow quieter. The birds were no longer singing, and the wind had stopped rustling the leaves. I felt like I was moving through a vacuum, like the world had narrowed down to just me and these tracks. The trees felt closer now, their trunks pressing in on either side, their branches hanging low, almost like they were reaching down to touch me. The tracks led me to a small clearing. It was eerily quiet. There was no wind, no sound of animals, just stillness. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, half buried in the earth. It looked weathered and ancient, covered in moss and vines. But what caught my attention were the marks on the stone. Deep, jagged scratches like something had been clawing at it for hours, maybe days. The scratches were fresh, too fresh to be natural wear. They were too sharp, too deliberate. My heart began to race. I had made a mistake coming here. This wasn't normal. The tracks, the strange silence. It all pointed to something that wasn't right. I turned to head back to the trail, but as I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe a shadow, a trick of the light. But when I looked again, it was still there. A man, or at least something that looked like a man. He was standing still, unmoving, his face hidden in the shadow of the trees. He was dressed in dark clothing, his body blending in with the surrounding forest so well that he almost looked like part of it. I froze, staring at him. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe another hiker, but deep down I knew it wasn't. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. He was watching me, and I felt it in the pit of my stomach. The heavy weight of being observed, the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I didn't know what to do. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Couldn't breathe. I was trapped in that moment, stuck in the eerie silence of the forest. The man, if that's what he was, never moved, never blinked. He just stood there watching. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Couldn't tell. Time didn't matter anymore. I couldn't look away, couldn't bring myself to take a single step. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't see him move, didn't hear him walk away. 1 second he was there, and the next he wasn't. The silence that followed was suffocating. My legs finally gave out, and I sank to the ground, breathing heavily, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real? Was I hallucinating? But then, there was a sound again. Something breaking the stillness. Something unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. I turned, and there, at the edge of the clearing, were more tracks. New ones, fresh, and this time they were leading away from me. With my heart pounding, I stood up, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. I didn't care to find out what or who was out there. The instinct for survival kicked in. I needed to leave. Now, I spun around and started running, not bothering to stay on the trail, just heading toward anything that looked like an escape. I didn't stop running until I saw the main trail again, the familiar markers I had seen earlier in the day. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my car, I could still feel the weight of those tracks, those eyes, that silence. And as I drove away from the forest, I realized something. I didn't know what had been out there in those woods, but it was something I never wanted to see again. I haven't hiked alone since. The sun had barely started to rise, casting faint orange hues across the horizon as I stood at the trailhead, looking at the winding path ahead. The air was cool, almost crisp, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath in the early morning stillness. I had always wanted to take this hike, the kind of secluded path not many people knew about. I read about it in some local hiking blog, where it was described as off the beaten track, perfect for those seeking solitude. Well, today I was seeking exactly that. The trail, tucked deep within the mountains, was marked by a faded sign that simply read, Skyline Loop. Not much else was offered. As I stepped forward and placed my first foot on the dirt path, the sounds of the world around me started to fade. The distant hum of the highway, the occasional chirp of birds, even the wind. It was like stepping into a different world, a world where nature ruled. The trail was narrow at first, with jagged rocks along the edges and tall pines looming on either side, their branches heavy with the weight of dew. The trail had a soft, squelchy feel beneath my boots, evidence of the rain that had come through the night before. The smell of wet earth and pine was thick in the air, and it felt refreshing. There was something about being in nature, far from the usual noise of the city, that gave me a sense of peace. I didn't know exactly how long this hike would take. The map I printed out was basic at best, with a few scribbled notes from the blog's author. Beautiful views, it said, but keep an eye out for unexpected drops. The last part made me pause for a moment, but I shrugged it off. The trail was supposed to be safe, right? After all, I had been hiking for years and had done much harder and more treacherous trails. This should be an easy one, I thought. A few hours into the hike, the path narrowed even further, forcing me to step carefully around thick, tangled roots and uneven patches of ground. The sound of running water reached my ears, and I soon spotted a small stream cutting across the trail. The water was crystal clear, rushing over smooth stones and continuing its journey down the mountain. I paused to take in the beauty of it, snapping a few pictures. I wanted to remember this moment of serenity, but as I continued down the trail, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle change in the air. A slight coolness. The sounds around me became muffled, like the forest had suddenly decided to be quiet. I couldn't hear the usual birds anymore, nor the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It felt unnervingly silent. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, I was in a remote area. It's probably just a quieter spot on the trail, I told myself. But then, as I walked deeper into the forest, I realized the air was getting thicker. The scent of pine was still there, but now there was something else. Something heavy, almost like damp wood, mold perhaps, mixed with the faint smell of something metallic. It was so faint I almost couldn't identify it at first, but it made me uneasy. That unease only grew when I looked around and realized the trees were getting taller and thicker, casting longer shadows. There were no signs of other hikers, and I hadn't seen any wildlife in a while either. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and my own breath, which now seemed too loud in the silence. I kept going, rationalizing that maybe this was just a less traveled part of the trail. I reminded myself I'd hiked through more remote areas before, places where there was no one for miles around. Still, the air seemed to grow heavier with each step. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where the trees opened up enough for sunlight to pour through. I paused here, stretching my legs and taking a drink from my water bottle. It was at that moment that I noticed the ground beneath me wasn't as firm as it should have been. Felt soft, almost sponge-like. Curious, I knelt down to investigate and found the earth was covered with a layer of rotting leaves and decaying plants. I pushed my fingers into the dirt, and it gave way easily, as though the ground had been disturbed recently. It wasn't until I stood up that I realized the sun had disappeared behind a thick curtain of clouds. A chill ran down my spine. The clouds seemed to roll in unnaturally fast, and a gust of wind swept through the clearing. It wasn't the usual mountain wind, sharp and clean, but a damp, cold breeze that cut through my jacket like it wasn't even there. The feeling of being watched crept over me, though I couldn't see anyone. I shook my head, trying to shake the creeping paranoia that was beginning to cloud my thoughts. I decided it was best to keep moving. The trail twisted ahead, steepening as it wound up the side of the mountain. It didn't take long for the trees to close in around me again, the trail narrowing even further. The silence returned, thick and unsettling. I kept moving, focusing on my breath and trying to ignore the feeling that had started to gnaw at me. But no matter how I tried, it was impossible to ignore. It was like I wasn't alone on the trail anymore. There was a presence, one that wasn't immediately apparent, but it was there. Just when I thought I could shake off the feeling, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. A small, dilapidated shack. It was hidden off the trail, nearly completely overtaken by vines and moss. It was the kind of structure you see in old horror movies, the kind that's long forgotten and left to rot in the woods. It wasn't much more than a broken shell now, but I couldn't help but feel a strange compulsion to go inside. I didn't know why, but something about it felt important. So, I approached cautiously, the sound of my boots crunching on the dry leaves more pronounced in the stillness. When I reached the door, which was hanging on its hinges, I hesitated. The inside was dark and smelled of damp wood, but I stepped inside anyway. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, the roof barely holding up against the weight of time. It wasn't the inside that caught my attention, though. It was what I saw on the walls. Scratches, deep, deliberate gouges on the wood, as though something had tried to escape. The marks were fresh, too, not from years ago, but from days or weeks. I backed out quickly, my pulse quickening. This place had been used, but by who? I didn't want to stick around any longer. I turned around and nearly ran back to the trail, heart hammering in my chest. The unease I had been feeling turned into outright fear. I didn't want to stay here anymore. I needed to get out of these woods. As I scrambled up the trail, I tried to push away the thoughts of what I'd seen, but they lingered. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was as if someone, or something, was tracking my every move. I forced myself to keep going, but the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. My pace quickened as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the path. I needed to find a way out, and soon. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding up and up the mountain with no end in sight. I felt the weight of the forest closing in on me, and with every step, the tension in my chest grew tighter. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the familiar outline of the trailhead in the distance. The road was just beyond the trees, and my heartbeat picked up again, this time with relief. I made it. I broke through the final stretch of trees and out onto the open, flat ground, where the car parked near the trailhead seemed like a beacon of safety. I didn't stop until I was in the car, the doors locked and the engine running. I looked out at the forest one last time, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stick around to see if it came back. I drove away, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen and felt out there. It was a place that had shifted in my mind. It had gone from peaceful to unsettling to downright dangerous in the span of a few hours. I've always been someone who enjoys the outdoors. Long walks in the woods, hiking through mountains, and pushing myself to explore places others might consider too wild or isolated. I had always seen nature as a place to escape the noise of everyday life, a peaceful retreat where I could unwind and clear my head. But that all changed one afternoon when I decided to take a solo hike on a trail I thought I knew well. It was a late autumn day, the kind where the leaves on the trees are just beginning to turn that perfect shade of amber and gold. The weather was crisp, the kind of chill in the air that makes you grateful for your jacket but doesn't freeze your bones. I'd been to this trail many times before, but something about that day felt different. There was a strange, unspoken heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite place. The trailhead was a small, quiet spot tucked into the woods. It wasn't heavily trafficked, which is exactly why I liked it. I could always count on solitude. The first part of the hike was easy enough, a wide, well-worn path that snaked through tall trees with leaves rustling in the wind. Birds chirped overhead, and I heard the occasional scurry of something small darting through the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The tall trees closed in on me, their branches weaving together to form a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The shadows in the forest grew longer, darker, and the air seemed to thicken. The peacefulness of the hike started to shift. I paused for a moment to adjust the straps on my backpack. That was when I noticed the first sign that something was off. The usual chatter of wildlife, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of birds had gone completely silent. Not a single animal made a sound. The only noise now was the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional flutter of wind through the trees. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to nothing more than my overactive imagination. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was too deep into my own head. I shrugged it off and continued forward. But then things got stranger. The further I walked, the more the path seemed to change. The trees around me were no longer the familiar ones I'd seen many times before. These were older, gnarled, their trunks twisted and covered in thick vines. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking up like fingers from the earth, making each step more difficult. My legs were starting to feel heavy, and the constant shifting of the trail was beginning to wear on me. I checked my watch. It was only 3 p.m., but the forest felt much darker than it should have. I had been on this trail before, but I didn't remember it being like this. A cold breeze swept through the trees, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. I rubbed my arms, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was now oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, though I knew I was alone. At least I thought I was. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I realized I was completely lost. The clearing should have been familiar. It had always been a place I passed through to rest or take in the view. But today it looked different. The trees surrounding it were arranged in an odd, almost unnatural pattern, as though someone had deliberately shaped them. There was no view of the mountains in the distance like I remembered, no sight of the river that normally ran through the valley below. It was just empty. I stopped in the middle of the clearing, trying to orient myself. I pulled out my map and checked it against the landscape. Something wasn't right. The map didn't match up with what I was seeing. The trail I was on didn't even appear to be on the map. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the path I had just come down seemed unfamiliar, as though it had changed while I wasn't looking. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. Panic started to creep in, but I fought it down. I had been in worse situations before. I could handle this, and find my way out. I decided to push forward. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, keeping an eye out for any landmarks I recognized. The trees seemed to loom closer around me, the path narrowing even more as I went. The wind howled through the branches now, sending leaves skittering across the ground like whispers. I glanced at my watch again. 4:30 p.m. The shadows were growing longer, and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. I had to keep moving. The thought of being stuck out here after dark filled me with dread. I pushed on, my steps quicker now, but my breath grew heavier. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the cold. There was something in the air, something strange and wrong. Then I heard it, a soft rustling from behind me. I stopped, my heart pounding. There was no way someone else was out here. I had been walking for hours without seeing a soul. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, continued, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. I stood there for a long moment trying to calm myself, to reason through it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound came again, this time closer, too close. I broke into a run. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted, my breath ragged in my chest. The rustling was still there, following me, echoing through the woods. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing, but the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. Finally, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. I had no idea how I hadn't noticed it before. It was weathered and covered in moss, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. But it was shelter, and I was desperate. I rushed inside, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The cabin was dark, musty, and smelled of decay, but it was a place to hide. I could hear the wind howling outside, the trees creaking and groaning in the storm. But there was something else, something faint, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. A whisper. I strained to listen. It was hard to tell if it was the wind, but it seemed to come from inside the cabin. I moved cautiously to the corner, trying not to make a sound, and that's when I saw it. The floorboards creaked underfoot. I wasn't alone in here. A figure, hunched and shadowy, moved across the room, just beyond the dim light filtering through the broken window. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in fear. It was barely visible, but it was there, moving as though it knew I was here too. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. I bolted for the door, my heart racing in my chest. As I grabbed the handle, I heard a sharp, guttural sound, something between a growl and a groan. I jerked the door open and ran out into the fading light, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the fear that threatened to take over. I didn't stop running until I saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance. The trailhead, the familiar entrance to the woods. When I reached it, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my body shaking. I looked behind me. The woods were silent again. The figures, the sounds, they were gone. I was safe. I spent the next hour making my way back to my car, still in a daze. I never told anyone about what happened, about the feeling of being followed, or the whispers I heard. I've tried to forget, to move on, but every time I walk into the woods, I feel that same unsettling presence. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I was just too deep in the wilderness, too tired. But I don't go on those trails anymore. The woods, once a peaceful refuge, now feel like something else, something dark and waiting. And as for the cabin, well, I heard someone else found it a few weeks later. They said it was empty, no signs of life, just the remnants of an old, forgotten place. But I know better. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some trails lead to things best left alone. The morning air was cool, a brisk wind rustling through the trees as I tightened the straps of my backpack. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks, ever since I'd heard about a trail that cut through some of the less traveled parts of the wilderness, far from the crowds and noisy tourists. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what I got when I started walking down the path. The trail was narrow at first, winding through dense woods. The trees were tall, their trunks thick with age, their branches thick enough to block out most of the sunlight. I could hear the chirping of birds and the occasional scurrying of small animals, but it was quiet. The kind of quiet where you start to notice every little sound. The snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves as the wind caught them, the distant trickle of a stream I couldn't yet see. The hike was peaceful at first, my boots crunching against the dirt, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. I had set out early, hoping to make it to the summit by late afternoon. I knew the trail was marked, but there were spots where the path was less clear, and you had to keep your wits about you. About 2 hours in, the trail began to get steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The path narrowed until I was walking almost single file, stepping over roots that jutted out of the ground like fingers reaching for me. The further I went, the quieter it became, almost unnervingly so. The birds had stopped singing, and the breeze had slowed to a standstill. A sense of isolation crept over me, but I tried to shake it off. I was just being paranoid. I'd hiked plenty of remote trails before. This was just part of it. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle and check my map. The trail was still marked, but there were fewer landmarks as I got higher. There was a sharp turn ahead, and the path seemed to open up a bit. I figured it would be a good spot to take a break, so I made my way toward the bend in the trail. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a pile of rocks off to the side, almost like someone had intentionally stacked them. It was small, maybe a foot high, just a collection of stones arranged in a perfect, if uneven, stack. It looked out of place. I squinted at it, trying to figure out if it had been there for a while or if it had been made recently. There was no sign of other human activity, no trash, no footprints except my own. It was just there. I didn't know why, but something about the rocks unsettled me. It wasn't that they were spooky or mysterious, not like some eerie rock formations you see in movies. They were just out of place. I felt a small twinge of unease, and before I could think much more about it, I continued along the trail. The further I went, the more the feeling of being watched began to settle on me. I could feel it like a weight on my shoulders. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. The woods were still, too still. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the air had thickened with humidity. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and looked out across the valley below me. The view was stunning. Endless green trees stretching out into the distance, crisscrossed by small streams that sparkled like silver ribbons in the sunlight. For a moment, I was able to push the strange sensation from my mind. This was why I came out here, to be alone with nature, to escape everything else. It was beautiful and it was calm, but then I noticed something else. There was a shadow in the valley, just beyond a small rise, where the trees thinned. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the more I realized it was a person. A figure standing just out of sight, in the tree line, barely visible except for the movement of their arms. They seemed to be waving. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone else hiking in the distance, waving hello. But there was something off about it, something wrong with how still they were. Like they weren't actually moving, but were just waiting for me to notice them. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I hadn't had enough water, or maybe it was just a trick of the shadows. Either way, I wasn't about to go back down the trail just because of some distant figure in the woods. So, I took a deep breath and started back down the ridge toward the main trail. That was when I heard it, the snap of a twig. It was unmistakable, right behind me. I whipped around, half expecting to see a hiker or some animal. But there was nothing, just the trees. Nothing moved. My pulse began to race as I stood frozen, my gaze sweeping over the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. I started walking again, faster this time. My steps were quick, but controlled, as I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong. Still, the feeling of being watched was growing, creeping over me like an oppressive weight. Couldn't shake it. I hadn't been on this trail before, and I didn't know what else lay ahead. But I knew that the path was becoming more difficult to follow. The trees were closer together now, and the trail was becoming obscured by thick underbrush. It was hard to tell which direction I was supposed to go, but I kept moving forward, hoping I wasn't getting lost. My map didn't seem to help much. The paths weren't marked as clearly as I had expected, and the landscape didn't match the map's contours. Then, something else caught my attention. A small clearing to the left of the trail. There was a structure there, an old wooden cabin, barely visible through the thicket. The roof had caved in, and the walls were weathered and decaying. I couldn't believe I had missed it earlier. It was so quiet, so secluded, that I wondered if anyone had been here in years. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to it, brushing aside the overgrown vines and thorns that had taken over the site. The door was partially open, the wood warped and cracked. Inside, it smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. I stepped closer, peering inside. There wasn't much to see, just broken furniture, a fireplace covered in soot, and dust coating the floor like a blanket. But there was something about the place that felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt like someone had been there recently. There were signs of life, scratches on the floor, a fire pit in the corner, and even a half-burned log that had been left in the hearth. A chill ran down my spine as I backed out of the cabin, suddenly aware of just how isolated I was. I had no phone service out here, and the nearest town was miles away. The sense of being watched was suffocating now, almost unbearable. I needed to keep moving. I forced myself to keep walking, the air thick and oppressive as I pushed through the undergrowth. The path was growing harder to follow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I could feel the tension in the air, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but eventually, I found a fork in the trail. One path seemed to continue through the trees, but the other veered off to the right, heading toward a small creek. My instincts told me to take the creek path, so I followed it, the sound of running water calming me slightly. As I neared the creek, I spotted something else. Another pile of rocks, this one much larger than the first. It was positioned in the middle of the creek, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it wasn't just one pile of rocks. There were several, forming a strange pattern, a kind of boundary. I stepped closer, but before I could get too close, I heard it again. The unmistakable snap of a twig behind me. This time, I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. I just started walking faster, heart racing. I had to get out of here. The woods were starting to feel like a trap. The rocks, the eerie stillness, it was all too much. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached a clearing, and there it was, the main trail. The path was wide again, and the trees had thinned. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I was closer. I could see the sign for the trailhead up ahead, the parking lot just beyond. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my car, windows rolled up, doors locked, breathing hard. As I drove away, the sun beginning to dip behind the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me out there. Something or someone. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my bag that I realized I had missed something. The map. There was a faint marking on it, a circle near the area where the piles of rocks were. And next to it, handwritten in faded ink, were the words, "Don't go past the creek."